Well, thank you for coming this noon, and students especially, thank you for showing up. I know you had conflicts. This is not what it appears to be at first blush, and it will be a lesson in not judging a book by its cover. This is a lecture on talking about family history. It is not, however, about this family history. These are the Hatfields. It has nothing to do with this kind of family history, nor this kind of family history. It has everything to do with this kind of family history. And what I want to talk about today are these connections. I'm going to get a different laser pointer, just a second. Yeah, that's much better. I want to talk about these connections and why they are important to you. And if I need to make a case for why this lecture and what I'm going to tell you is very important, I would state simply that this is instructional in how you should be as physicians, and in a couple of cases, how you should not be. And we will return to that message again and again as we go through the lecture material. So I will simply say to you, don't forget what I said at the start of this lecture. Now, it is true that I called, or rather talked with Dr. O'Brien a few months ago about coming, and from him I got this information that he had, or has had, 4 mentors. Dr. Holtzapfel, you know. Harvey J. Cohen, you probably don't know. And you have not heard, I'm sure, about Roy Gerard or Timothy Cunahan. We will talk about these 2 in a moment. But there is a fun story about Roy Gerard, who was a GI in the Battle of the Bulge during World War II and was medevaced on Christmas Eve from that battle. The person who was flying the plane was a man named William Close, who later became a surgeon and came back to Michigan for a visiting professorship where he met Dr. Gerard, and they began talking and realized that Dr. Close had been the pilot of the plane on Christmas Eve that medevaced Dr. Gerard. And they realized this because they both remembered the very beautiful nurse who was also on that plane. I got this story from Dr. Close's daughter, who lives in Maine, who is Glenn Close, the actress. So Harvey J. Cohen is known nationally now for his work in geriatric oncology, and was one of O'Brien's mentors. And so if we examine for a moment the lineage from Harvey J. Cohen backwards in time, you yourselves will get some idea of your academic lineage to the extent that you are exposed by and taught by Dr. O'Brien and his mentees who are here at the University of Louisville. Dr. Cohen's principal mentor was a legendary physician at Duke, Eugene Stead. He was a man far ahead of his time and had done major work in cardiovascular physiology at Duke, but also is probably known historically as the person who started the first schools for physician's assistants at Duke. His chief mentor was the first physician-in-chief at Brigham and Women's Hospital, which at the turn of the 19th, 20th century was known as the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital. After his appointment and before the hospital was built, he took some faculty and residents to Europe, and they visited several European hospitals to sort of get some ideas about how the Brigham ought to be constructed. And then he, in a very monumental move, made sure that the clinical clerks in the medical school got on the wards along with the resident teams. Christian, who was called by the medical students and the residents Uncle Henry, was trained chiefly by William Osler. Now, just for my own interest, how many of you have heard of William Osler? Just raise your hands. So most of you had. That's reassuring. Osler is certainly one of the most influential physicians in the last 100 years. He is considered to be the founder of modern internal medicine. He came out of the country in Ontario, went to school in Toronto, and then graduated with an MD at McGill, and taught there as a professor for many years before moving on to Penn and to Johns Hopkins and finally to Oxford, where he ended his career. He did a number of things. He wrote a number of things. He is chiefly remembered in his writings for a book called Equanimitas. I would urge you to find it. I am certain your library has a copy. Just search up William Osler, Equanimitas, and it's spelled A-E-Q. He was also extremely kind to residents and students, gave them a key to his house, and he called them his latchkey children. Now, if we look at the lineage further, you can see that one of Stead's other mentors was Joseph Aub at Mass General, an oncologist and eminent diagnostician whose chief mentor was David Edsall, and we're going to go back to Edsall again. Edsall's grandfather in this academic lineage was Alfred Stille, who was from Philadelphia. And there is a great story about a bunch of American medical students who went to France, to Paris, to study in the 1830s. They did so because dissections were forbidden. Any kind of anatomy was taught by robbing graves, and there were no microscopes in American medical schools. France was way ahead of us at the time. And so Stille, along with William Pepper's father and Oliver Wendell Holmes and a few other students, went to Paris and studied under Pierre-Louis Dupuytren and Marie-Louise Lachapelle, whom we'll talk about in a moment. In 1833, on July 4th, they decided to celebrate the Independence Day, and so went to a very tony, up-class nightclub restaurant called Frascati's, and they invited the Marquis de Lafayette, who showed up. The Marquis de Lafayette, you'll remember, commanded the French forces in the U.S. and helped us in our fight for independence. Louis was the first to use biostatistics. He went through the hospital in Paris and logged all kinds of observations from history and physical examination, and got data from over 5,000 patients to form some sort of primitive idea of how biostatistics could inform us about hospital illnesses and patient outcomes. And he was trained by the great Laennec. We'll talk about him in a moment. I want to go back, though, to Edsel, who's right here, and talk about his chief claim to fame. Sometimes the best thing a person does academically in medicine is to promote someone else. And no matter how much you do, how great you are as a physician or researcher, sometimes history remembers you for that. And this is the case of Edsel. He was chairman of medicine at the Brigham, and then became dean of the medical school. And around the early 1900s, 1910 or so, at a time when workers were being poisoned in the workplace, he saw the need for a Department of Occupational Health. He found that the leading person in occupational health was Alice Hamilton. She had returned from training and then going to Europe with her sister Edith and attending medical lectures there, to the city of Chicago, where she correctly diagnosed the etiology of and the treatment of typhoid fever, at least the treatment of it in terms of public health measures. When she had gone to Europe and attended lectures in Munich and in Leipzig, she and Edith were told to sit in the back row because no other women were allowed in the lecture halls, and they didn't want the two women distracting the professor or the male students. Edsel wanted her to head up the Department of Occupational Health. She would be the first woman professor at Harvard Medical School. There were no women students. She would teach men. There was a huge fight, and Edsel contended with the Board of Trustees of Harvard, who finally relented under three conditions. Dr. Hamilton could not get tickets for the Harvard-Yale football game. She could not go to the Harvard Club, and she could not march in commencement. She went on to be the first woman who won the Lasker Award for public health, and she was the first woman to be listed in Who's Who Among American Men in America, in the United States. She retired in 1935 at the rank of assistant professor, so she never got promoted. She never advanced in rank. And she died slightly after her 100th birthday in Connecticut while tending her roses. Alice Hamilton. So the fourth mentor for Dr. O'Brien is Timothy Cunahan. And you will see from this slide that Dr. O'Brien and I are, in the academic genealogic sense, first cousins, and you probably can note that he is slightly younger than I am. You look at these two pictures. When I talked to Dr. O'Brien, he said that his chief mentor at the University of Dublin was Timothy Cunahan, a cardiologist who was trained in London and who taught him a great deal about medicine and about physical diagnosis. I was intrigued enough by this to check the membership ranks of the American College of Cardiology, since Dr. O'Brien told me that Cunahan was still alive. And he was listed as an international member of the ACC, and his contact information was there. So I said, why not? And I picked up the phone and direct dialed to Dublin, and Dr. Cunahan answered at the other end of the phone. And he was, for the first minute or so, a bit cagey and, you know, well, who are you again and why are you calling? And I explained this, and I said, and do you remember Dr. O'Brien? Sure. Jim, yes, I do. He tells me you trained in London. Oh, goodness, no. I trained in Boston. And I said, oh, Boston. Where? Mass General? And Ed Bland was my chief mentor there. My mentor, my program director, Bill Morgan, also trained at Mass General. Cunahan remembers Morgan. Morgan vaguely remembers Cunahan. I've since talked to Bill about that connection. Both of them, of course, remember Ed Bland, who was the successor to Paul Dudley White at the General, arguably the first American cardiologist. Bland was an expert in rheumatic heart disease, in cardiac auscultation, and in the teaching of physical diagnosis. And any student, resident, or fellow who had him absolutely adored him. He was very gentle in his teaching, very non-confrontational, very quiet, as someone we will meet in a bit, Marcello Malpighi, was quiet. And so here is that lineage from Cunahan through Bland to Paul Dudley White, who was Eisenhower's physician. White, who was sent to Europe to learn this new thing called cardiology. The chair of medicine at Mass General had a handful of very excellent interns in pediatrics and in medicine and sent them various places to subspecialize. It was Paul Dudley White's mission to go to England and study under Sir Thomas Lewis. Lewis is chiefly known for perfecting Einthoven's EKG apparatus and developing it for use in cardiovascular diagnosis. And you know who these three are? Sure you do. Wolfe, Parkinson, White. Sir Thomas Lewis studied under Sir James Mackenzie. Somewhat interesting in that he was a general practitioner for 27 years and then decided to roll up his sleeves, go to London, and become a cardiologist. And he was probably the first British card-carrying pure cardiologist. And some of these names you will perhaps recall: Bence Jones, von Liebig, Gay-Lussac, back to Lavoisier, the founder of modern chemistry. Before Lavoisier, it was thought that oxidation, combustion, was due to a release of a substance within a combustible material called phlogiston. And when something burned, it released this substance, this phlogiston, which then gave off light and heat. And it fell to Lavoisier to discover oxygen and the oxidative process. And here you see him in his lab being distracted, as researchists sometimes are, by this lovely young lady. He was an aristocrat in France, and so was guillotined at the time of the French Revolution. Now if we look at the O'Brien lineage, we can go back through Lavoisier to Buffon, Malpighi, and Borelli, and back through Laennec, Corvisart, Bichat, and Desceaux to Borelli. Malpighi was an excellent teacher and described by Cecile Mettler, a medical historian, as so modest and humble that he was virtually ignored by his contemporaries. You will meet people like this in medicine. Don't ignore them. Buffon, his student, challenged centuries of Catholic teaching that argued for a limited existence of the planet to 6,000 years and to not a theory, but a teaching of standard creation. Everything was created, and that's the way it is. There was no evolution. And Buffon, noticing the similarities between men and apes 100 years before Darwin, challenged these two theories. Corvisart was Napoleon's physician, lost his first job when he wouldn't wear a wig. He was taught by Bichat, who began teaching in Paris at 29, died of tuberculosis at 31, was so popular that 600 students attended his funeral. And Borelli, who arguably has the finest faculty I have ever seen, was taught not only through Harvey's writings, but by Descartes and Galileo as well. Borelli was the founder of modern biophysics, biomechanics, and wrote a textbook on locomotion of living species. And then finally we get to William Harvey, who, although it may seem today to be a minor discovery, the discovery of and the description of circulation was a monumental achievement. And it was from this that he gained his fame and developed literally hundreds of disciples and researchists who began to think like him. Malpighi was one of them, of course. So, in an academic genealogic sense, then, here you people are, represented here, and 16 generations back, you go directly ascending to William Harvey. And if this were represented on some sort of genealogy chart, then here is O'Brien here are you people, and there is William Harvey up here. And that 55-cent stamp you saw earlier. But let's go back further. Vesalius, who was referred to this morning at the beginning of Grand Rounds, was Harvey's grandfather in this genealogic sense. His greatest achievement was, I think, in actually teaching hands-on anatomy and dissection. Before he came around, the professor held a textbook, had a dissector dissecting the body, and the students would sit, much as you are, and observe this dissection and learn very little. We're going to go all the way back now, 500 more years, to Constantine the African. Constantine Africanus was a physician who was quite effective enough that people began to believe that he was a magician, and he was hounded out of the Middle East and North Africa, crossing the Mediterranean to Italy, and settling initially in Salerno, where the first Western medical school was founded, and then ultimately going to the Benedictine Abbey in Monte Cassino, where he became a monk but continued to teach and to translate. He was one of the pivotal great translators, translating the ancients, Hippocrates and Galen, into the Latin so it was accessible to Western Europe from the Arabic, which the great Muslim translators had perpetuated, as we will see. So a millennium now separates you from Constantine the African. There is another young lady that I want you to meet, and she falls in this piece of history down here. So not too far, a couple hundred years descended from Constantine the African, is Alessandra Giuliani. She was a magnificent anatomist and dissector and made her boss, Mondino de Luzzi, famous. In fact, when Giuliani died, DeLuzzi was never heard from again and wasn't publishing anymore. Giuliani, I think it's safe to say, did all the work. One of the things she invented was the technique of injecting colored liquid into the arteries and veins, which would then harden, and she could then dissect the course and relations of the smallest vessels. She is mentioned in William Osler's textbook of medical history in this way. She died at the young age of 19, consumed by her labors, and the monument to her is yet to be found. And now back to our straight lineage from Harvey at the bottom to Constantine the African at the top. And if we represented this in a genealogy chart, then you would see O'Brien and Holtzapfel here, you people represented down here, and there's Monte Cassino up here with William Harvey here, and one of my favorites, Hermann Boerhaave here, so-called affectionate guardian of students. And there's a millennium. What's this? What's this building? First hospital in Louisville. It's first actually teaching hospital in Louisville. Okay, now back from Constantine back through history, and we will stop here with Avicenna. How many of you have ever heard of Avicenna? Okay, so you all raise your hands, but how many of you can tell me one thing he did? Raise your hand. Where are you? What do you mean infectious disease?
He was the guy who first said that diseases were transmitted by particles we can't see.
No. That's good, though. That's good, because we're going to meet him about 300 years before, and he was pivotal in Avicenna's teachings. So you get a passing grade for that answer. Anyone else? If you got all historians of science, medical historians together in a hall, and you asked them to list the 3 greatest physicians of all ages, they would all name Avicenna, and they would argue about the other 2. And yet, for whatever reason, and perhaps one that should be examined, we're ignorant of him and of what he accomplished. He was a prodigy who had memorized the Quran by the age of 13, memorized all there was to know about medicine at the age of 18. He proved Euclid's first 4 postulates and tried to prove the 5th, which is as yet not proven. He was the first to observe and describe the transit of Venus across the sun at a time before there were telescopes. And he wrote the canon of medicine, which was so complete, including a pharmacopoeia of 760 herbal pharmaceuticals, that this was used in medical schools in the West until the 17th century. In fact, his knowledge and display of knowledge was so stultifying that people sort of gave up. And that's something to remember from that first slide I told you. This is, in a part, a lecture on how not to be. Don't ever let that voice, oh, I can never be that smart. I'll never learn all this stuff. I'll never be as good as she is. Don't let that voice take over. But at any rate, tremendous achievements from Avicenna. And it's from him through Avenzoar that the greatest Jewish physician of the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, Maimonides, is found. And for 6-7 centuries, Maimonides was the sole vehicle through which Jewish thought, both medical teachings and philosophy of religion, came to the West. He wrote in Arabic. It was translated by his student, Samuel ibn Tibbon, and he wrote a textbook of philosophical theology called The Guide for the Perplexed. There's Maimonides. And there's the cover of that book, as well as his textbooks of medicine, of which this is a page. And now we'll go back 200-300 years to the infectious disease guy. This is Muhammad al-Razi, or in his Western name, Rhazes, who wrote the most complete description of the measles, variola kinds of cutaneous infectious diseases. He was asked to build a hospital in Baghdad, and he directed over 30 pieces of meat to be hung at several locations in Baghdad, and then a week later went to the place where the meat was least putrefied and directed that the hospital be built there. This was 1,000 years before Pasteur. These are the words he lived by. No blame is there upon the blind, nor any blame upon the lame, nor any blame upon the sick. And as for the insane, feed and clothe them and speak kindly to them. Muhammad al-Razi. And now back several hundred years to the Venerable Bede, a monk at Yarrow in England, who was reputed to be the most learned man of his time, and who was a collector of data and of knowledge, both medical and non-medical. He was the first to reference his writings and also give an analysis of the strength of those references that had never been done before. It was common for translators, for writers of science, merely to appropriate knowledge before that time. And so there's the Venerable Bede, and now we'll go back to Galen. Briefly, Claudius Galen, who lived just about 100 or 200 years before the birth of Christ, was a legendary physician who treated gladiators, who was very effective in his doctoring, who was detested by his students to the extent that students would not own up to having been students of his. He was both respected and he castigated his colleagues and tried to magnify his own brilliance by reducing theirs. He wrote at the rate of 500 pages a year, and perhaps his most colossal mistake was assuming that the anatomies of man and the Barbary ape were the same. And so his treatises on human anatomy were drawn from his anatomical dissections of the Barbary ape. Big mistake, and one that was not uncovered for about 800 or 900 years. And here he is supposedly directing therapy, the patient on the left being handed medicine by the nurse in traditional nursing garb. The pharmacist in the center is mixing up things. Asclepius is leaning on a bust of Hippocrates, and they both are looking somewhat skeptical at the whole scene. We're going to go back now several hundred more years to this lady. And what is depicted here? I would guess none of you have ever heard of Agnidice before. No. What do you think is being depicted by these pictures? Well, Agnidice was the daughter of a merchant in Athens, where at the time women were forbidden to study or practice medicine. With her father's permission, she went to Alexandria in Egypt. She cut her hair short, disguised herself as a man, and studied under the great Herophilus. She then went back to Athens, still disguised as a man, and practiced medicine. The story is that she met a young woman in labor who did not want a man examining her, and so Agnidice exposed herself to the patient to reassure her that in fact she was a woman. The obstetricians in Athens and the gynecologists accused her of having relations with her female patients, thinking that she was a man, and they took her to court because of the competition, the turf battle, this kind of thing. Some things never change. And she was being prosecuted for this alleged offense when she disrobed in court and revealed that she was a woman, whereupon she was charged for practicing medicine as a woman. The justices of the court were in the back room, and they spoke out to their husbands on the court bench and said, if you accuse and punish her, you punish us. Meaning, put her to death, you put us to death. So Agnidice was allowed to practice medicine as long as her patients were female. And this was the big breakthrough in antiquity for allowing women physicians. Now, let's go back here to a rough contemporary of Herophilus, Erasistratus, who was a great diagnostician. He is depicted here on the left side of the patient, holding the patient's hand to feel the pulse, with his other hand, his right hand, over the precordium. The patient is Antiochus, who is the son prince of King Seleucus, who is seen at the head of the bed holding his son. Antiochus is dying. Nobody can figure out why. All of the king's physicians in court could not make a diagnosis. He's pale in this portrait. He's lost weight. And Erasistratus, because he reads the literature and he's read the love poems of Sappho, knows that this is unrequited love. But he's the king's son. He's a prince. Where would there ever be a woman inaccessible to him? So Erasistratus observes his patient while the court lovelies sort of parade by, and that's depicted here in this wonderful painting. And when Stratonice comes to the foot of the bed, the pulse and respirations of Antiochus quickened, he sweats, and Erasistratus realizes that the young prince is in love with the beautiful second wife of his father, Stratonice. So through some neat manipulations, he convinces Seleucus to give up his wife with her permission to his son Antiochus and give them the upper kingdom in what is now Syria, Lebanon. At the risk of running over, I have to tell you this wonderful story. This painting won the Prize of Rome in 1805. It is considered a priceless masterpiece. It is owned by the School for Fine Arts in Paris. And 2 years ago, on the occasion of my going there, I wrote to them and asked if I could visit them and see the painting. It's not a museum, it's a school, and so you need permission to go in while there are classes. So I went there, and I went to the woman I had been writing, and she called a young curator who said, you can see we're under construction. The place was a mess, plaster everywhere, bricks and mortar everywhere. And she said, all of the artwork is being stored, but I know where it is. And so we went to this room, which was a colossal room that had a number of oil paintings sort of leaning up against each other. And she went to a locker that with a number, opened it, and she said, here it is, help me lift it out. And together with her, I lifted this painting out. This thing is about 8 by 6 feet. It's a huge painting. The painting is very vivid, much more so than this slide. And we set it on some rubber mats, and she got me a chair, and she said, here, sit here and look at it as long as you like. Erasistratus diagnosing the illness of Antiochus. And then so back to Hippocrates, who is as good as they say. I won't tell you too much about him. He made house calls. He visited many of the Greek islands. He treated the sick. He attended people in epidemics at his own personal risk. The Islamic historians say that he had a daughter, and that her daughter's name in Greek meant Aesculapius, like woman doctor. You can't find that anywhere else in history. So there is no corroborating evidence that there was a daughter physician at Hippocrates. One would think there ought to have been. The histories do say that 17 generations back, in direct lineage of physicians who were also biologic parents, Hippocrates is descended from Aesculapius. And so now here you are, 3 millennia removed from Aesculapius himself. So before Karen Blixen changed her name to Isak Dinesen in order to get published in Denmark, before Leo Tolstoy told us his stories, or Victor Hugo wrote the greatest novel ever written, before Cervantes or Shakespeare, before Caravaggio or Copernicus, before the great Leonardo, Botticelli, before the first hospitals in Europe, here St. Paul's painted by Van Gogh, before Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, Archimedes, the great library of Alexandria, before the death of Socrates, the writings of Plato, before Euripides wrote, "Those whom the gods love die young," before the Battle of Marathon, Sophocles, before Anaximander invented the sundial, before Aeschylus, before Confucius or the Buddha, before the greatest poet of antiquity, Sappho, before the siege of Troy, there were physicians. Here Aesculapius with his daughter Hygeia. And descended in 17 generations to Hippocrates, who had a daughter who was a physician and who gave us the oath. And from him descended Herophilus, who taught Agnidice. And descended further Hypatia of Alexandria, stoned to death by the priests of Egypt out of academic jealousy. The great Avicenna, Alessandra Giuliani, down to Hildegard of Bingen, Andreas Vesalius, whose birthday is today, William Harvey, Thomas Willis, Hermann Boerhaave, affectionate guardian of students, to Louis Pasteur, to the 4 great physicians of Hopkins, Alice Hamilton, who never got a promotion, to Ed Bland, Roy Gerard, Harvey J. Cohen, Kenneth Holtzapfel, James O'Brien. To you. And there's your lineage. There's 3 millennia from Aesculapius at the top, Monte Cassino right about here, William Harvey here, down to you people. And so if there is a message, it is to bring honor to your ancestors, to be affectionate guardians to your students, and for your patients, feed and clothe them, and speak kindly to them. Now, before I end, I have a handout, and perhaps Tam and Emily could help me with this. Could you come up? Right out front. And this is the bottom, so one of you hold that, and the other roll up the top. And just come out here so they can see this. Yep, that's good. Hold it. Yep, up. So, Dr. O'Brien, I'm so glad you came. Just hold it straight up and down. This is a print of this. It is printed on archival stock paper, so it won't fade. It should be mounted just with push pins, not tape. And you will see that it will fit any wall. It will accommodate the floorboard type thing and the top thing as well. If you return it to, if you take it out and return it to the cylinder, put it in the plastic sleeve first so that it doesn't stick. And I made 3 of these for you and Dr. Holtzapfel and for the program.
Oh, thank you.
So you want to put this away? You have to roll it up really tight and then put it in the sleeve, okay? There you go.
Obviously, I very little time to accomplish something exceptional. And it was a fearful of the call to the government, to Professor Krugman, that hopefully you might remember me for the right reasons.
Here you go.
Thank you so much.
Sure, there's 2 of them there, so you take them both. You might have to roll it tighter. Yes. So we have plenty of time for questions, and I would welcome any. Yes, sir.
I like this kind of spiritual heritage that can be translated into almost any profession or group. And one of the factors beginning of this is much except there is a relationship. Would you reflect upon the possible genetic factors that are involved?
Well, there were genetic factors. I didn't really take the time to point them out. Obviously, the 17 generations from Aesculapius alleged down to Hippocrates, according to the ancient historians, is pure genetics. These people were father and son all the way down to 17 generations of physicians. There were Islamic physicians in the Dark Ages, the Bactriushos, and there were 7 or 8 generations of them who were father and son. And there are some tremendous stories there. I will tell you one. Jajiri Bactriushu was looking for a job, and I think he went to Baghdad, and the Sultan gave him an interview, much like the interviews we give, and said, I'm going to give you an unknown, and if you can make the diagnosis, you have the job. And so he had the secretary come in with a beaker of urine. Now, the urine was a donkey urine, but of course they didn't tell Bactriushu that. And the story goes that he swirled the beaker and he smelled it, and he said, the young lady is sick, but nothing that a little bit of hay and water won't cure. Any other questions? The chart and the lineage obviously represents a lot of work over a long time, and a lot of generosity in the part of historians. For one example, I was trying to make a link, a physical link between Harvey and Borelli. It was known in Borelli's writings that he owed, as he said, the greatest amount of his knowledge to William Harvey. But did they ever meet? Harvey studied in Padua, Borelli was in Rome. Did they ever meet? And ultimately, I wrote to a professor of history at the University of Rome, Giovanni Volante, and I asked him the question. He assigned a graduate student to answer the question. And she did research in the libraries, and then they wrote back to me and said they can't find any evidence that the two ever met, but certainly through his writings and his discoveries, Harvey tremendously influenced Giovanni Borelli. Other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
How can we move away from that religious wave of business of medicine that drives us now back to the inspirational and noble of medicine that, to me and to many others, was the reason why we started that path?
Well, it's a good question. How can we move away from all of the business and tedium that we find ourselves in and return to medical humanism? You are luckier than most places. You have in place this visiting scholar program, and this can be done every year. As Dr. O'Brien did, you can coordinate contact with the visiting professor in the Department of Medicine, the Department of Family Practice, and this Gaines lecture. The problem is, and this is, I would admit, partly my fault, that the attendance is off because I'm competing with the basketball game, which is about to start in a half an hour, and I'm aware of that. And sometimes those things need to be anticipated when planning these kinds of things. And the other thing is the title of the talk was probably off-putting, and people may have looked at this and said, who wants to hear about family history? I never take it anymore anyway, and why should I go to a lecture and be made to feel guilty? But now that I'm done, and this is over, and there's a period at the end of the sentence, let me say that medical students of all 4 grades should be here. And the residents, where possible, especially should be here. And young faculty should be here. This kind of stuff is very important and very compelling to those age groups. And you can do that. You have the program in sight. It doesn't have to be 2 or 3 days. It could be a week. You certainly, the city has enough to offer, and my wife and I were saying last night after dinner, I wish we'd known. We would have come for a week. We would have planned to be here all 5 days and not just fly in on Wednesday and fly out on Friday. Any other questions or comments?
Are you aware of a story in the state of Louisiana where a graduate of the University of Bologna applied for a license, and the board said that we need a letter from your dean telling us where your school is, and the dean of the University of Bologna said this medical school was established even before they discovered the United States.
I had not heard that story, but there is a story about a Chinese emperor who had a very favorite medical student, and he wanted this medical student to, and this is now in the 16th century, wanted this medical student to get the very best education in the West that he could. So he wrote to Hermann Boerhaave, whom he knew of, and he put on the envelope, Hermann Boerhaave, Europe. And it got to him, and the kid went to the Holland and was taught by Boerhaave. That's being famous. Other questions or comments? Yes?
Do you feel that women in medicine and the challenges they face
Is there any, well, is there any doubt that I believe that? And is there any doubt that it's true? Certainly. I think in many ways what Alice Hamilton went through was the history of Alessandra Giuliani and of Agnudice in some differences. I mean, Hypatia had a particularly tough time. She was around 200 or 300 AD. She also lived in Alexandria. She was considered the foremost mathematical mind of the century and the greatest teacher. She had a huge following. She was an atheist or agnostic. It's not clear. And the bishops of, the Catholic bishops of Alexandria had her stoned and had her flesh carved away from her bones with shells. So a little bit tougher lot than you've had thus far. But yes, history does repeat itself, not just with women, but Aeschylus, I showed you his picture. The great playwright of antiquity said, everybody hates the alien. And that's true today. IMGs really get the shaft. And very little has changed there. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.